Content warning. The following episode will be addressing linguistic ableism. You will be hearing ableist terminology at various points throughout the episode to showcase the harms of discriminatory language. Please proceed accordingly. This is Katrin with Disability Rights New York. Welcome to our podcast, Empire State of Rights. We are here to bring you information on the most relevant topics regarding disability rights and advocacy. Today, we welcome Bela Gaytán, a technical instructional designer at a tech startup. She's a DEIA consultant to NASA Astrophysics and a 2022 top 100 LGBT+ future leader role model, and so much more. She's going to discuss linguistic ableism as an equity barrier within our communities and how using inclusive language can enact societal and cultural change. Bela, thank you so much for joining us today.
Hi, Katrin. It's so wonderful to be here. Thank you for having me.
So before we start today, I want to give our audience our audio descriptions. I am a white female in my late 40s. I have long brown wavy hair. I have an orange shirt on today, and I don't know if we can see it today, but I have a blue necklace that I generally wear. And I think that's about it today. And Bela, can you provide us with your self-description and share the extensive work as an activist with our audience?
Absolutely. I am a light-skinned Latina woman with short, dark, curly hair, shaved sides. I'm wearing a black sleeveless pantsuit, dark lipstick, colorful eyeshadow, and jewelry. Behind me is a sage green wall with plants and figurines. So in terms of my activism, I like to say that it was straight from the womb. I've always been the type to stand up for people and see injustices in the world and speak out against them. I'm also biracial. My parents were field workers. I'm a single mom. My kids are triracial. I've lived in poverty and I have multiple rare diseases. So just considering even all that in my personal life, I've witnessed so much exclusion and racism and ableism, and not just in my own life, but in the world around us. But my activism didn't really become like a conscious effort until a few years ago when I became, and I'm doing air quotes here, when I became disabled. Let me explain that. I'm 47 years old, and throughout my childhood, I had no official diagnoses, right? We simply recognized that I had little minor health problems here and there, and seemingly harmless characteristics like being very bendy, referring to my hypermobility, and being able to do all kinds of cool parlor tricks when people would come over, like, look what Bela can do, right? And it wasn't until I turned 43 that I got my first diagnosis. And since then, I've accumulated 4 more rare disease diagnoses. I'm in the process of getting a 5th one diagnosed, and there's an additional 6th one that I likely have. So that experience just kind of catapulted me into advocacy and activism from more of like a proactive state of mind instead of like a reactionary state of mind.
I love so much that you shared all of that with our audience. When we talk about activism and we talk about what it is that really is the impetus for so many people when they start this journey, it often will start with themselves or a family member. And to your point, being diagnosed later in life will have you sometimes looking back as an observer to see really how things look so differently through that lens now. Would you say that that's pretty accurate?
Oh, yes. You really hit the nail on the head there because there's a lot to unpack when I look back, and I'll be honest, there's a lot of times that I'm angry and I'm thinking, why didn't someone pick up on this sooner? If I would have had treatment for XYZ condition when I was smaller, maybe I wouldn't have this issue now. So it's it's really weird when you look back though, and you're like, oh, so that's why this happened. Oh, so that's why I couldn't do that,
Right.
But yeah, definitely like hindsight is 2020 and then some. So it definitely, you have to really look inward and try to have some forgiveness. I like to think that in any moment, people are doing the very best that they can in that moment. And that helps me when I start thinking about tossing blame at others for not, picking up on things, and then the life that I've had since then. So I just try to analyze it, feel those big feelings, and just, move on knowing that, everyone was doing the best that they could.
Think about the tools that were available in the 70s, right? Are a little different than there are now. And while like broad sweeping changes happened in the 70s, as we just, I don't want to say celebrated, but we just acknowledged the 50-year anniversary of Willowbrook. We're talking about the early 70s and how things were changing then. So when I think about all that you just shared, there's the part of it that is the work that you're doing now is so based in your experience and the help and the assistance and the activism that you are bringing to this community is really just a testament to the work that you've done in acknowledging that observation. So I just want to thank you for sharing, and thank you for your activism, especially from this perspective. And when you talk about yourself and your own intersectionality, language is a big thing. And words matter. It's like something we say here all the time. Our executive director says it almost every day when we speak about communication. And the truth is that inclusive language is part of your work and your work around informing and educating the population. And I think it's interesting also, until you meet someone who needs different language. And it's funny to even say needs different language, but as language is organic and it is a living organism, it's going to change. So we'll give a little bit of academic history, from the Linguistic Society of America. As they stated, inclusive language acknowledges diversity, conveys respect to all people, is sensitive to differences, and promotes equal opportunities. Can you talk about the damage of what ableist language does and how we can really start to, and how we really are starting to challenge the social constructs that have been created by linguistic ableism and the importance of inclusive language?
Yeah, absolutely. I was just talking yesterday, actually, on a podcast, and I'm bringing over something that I said there. I said, I think people hear the word disabled and they immediately think of misery, despair, hopelessness. And then we have these ableist terms, and I will apologize in advance because I'm going to say some ableist terms and, potentially painful language here. And it's only in, the spirit of educating. But we have ableist terms like confined to a wheelchair or bedbound, burn victim. And then we have things like special needs, handy capable. And it's all because people see disability as such a horrible thing. They don't even want to acknowledge it anything other than, right? And in doing so, and in doing so, they other us. We aren't disabled, we're special needs. I'm doing air quotes. We're handy capable. We have different abilities, and it's so harmful. It's so harmful because it reduces us to something other, something less than, something, that we are beneath them, right? And people will use disabilities as an adjective, and this one really gets me. And I'll use one as an example. Let's talk about it's obsessive compulsive disorder, OCD. folks who say, oh, my OCD is so bad. Like I have to have everything in its proper place, or I just go crazy. Like that is wrong on so many levels right there, but they don't have a diagnosis of OCD. They've never seen a doctor for OCD. They've never experienced the pain that people go through with OCD and these, compulsive actions and intrusive thoughts that can be completely just so painful, right? But they just go by that singular trait of the stereotype that people with OCD are very, very organized. And then they stop there. And it's so harmful because it reduces people with OCD to people that are organized. And so then you get people that pick up on that. And it's like, they've got OCD. That's nothing. Like they're just organized. They should be thankful. They should be thankful that they have that and they can be so organized, right? In terms of like, you said challenging social constructs.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah.
One of my really good friends, she's an amazing advocate, amazing human being, Mary Fashik of Upgrade Accessibility. She recently posted about her style of advocacy. And she said, I know that my style is not palatable to everyone because I am authentic and I am raw. And that really spoke a lot to me because and I'm paraphrasing here, of course, but that really spoke a lot to me because that's my style. I'm like, it's my tagline in a lot of places due to people always saying this about me, that I am authentic, transparent, and vulnerable. And in trying to challenge society in using ableist, language, I always leverage lived experience anytime that I can. That's my thing, because I feel like people connect so much more when they have an actual person to put to a story instead of feeling like they're just learning about it through like a case study or research, right? And I have a saying, in discomfort, we grow. Anytime that I start off different trainings on, DEI, AB, which is diversity, equity, inclusion, accessibility, and belonging, I tell folks, you may feel uncomfortable, and that's okay. I challenge you to sit in that discomfort and try to understand why. Why do you feel uncomfortable? Do you feel uncomfortable because maybe you've had the same thought or experience before that I am now telling you is, it's non-inclusive? As an example, my uncle is developmentally and intellectually disabled. And one of the stories that I've told people before, and I will do a content warning here as well, I'm going to use a slur, is sitting outside with him one day and watching him cry as he talks about people calling him a retard. And these are adults, by the way, that were doing this to him. It wasn't, little kids that, learned this crap from their parents. These were adults that literally followed him around a store and just kept on and on and on calling him that. And it's just horrible. And I want people to hear stories like that. And I want them to feel uncomfortable. Maybe they used the R word before. And maybe they've been called the R word before. Or maybe they're just a really awesome human and they hear a term like that and an experience like that, and they get upset because, someone who is disabled is being treated as, less than deserving of dignity, respect, and love.
Well, let me ask you, there's so many things, right? When we're talking about othering and we're talking about like diagnosis-based adjectives and descriptors of people, and they're never good, right? Like it's never like there's a diagnosis-based adjective or description in someone where they're saying, hey, this is great because it's, and also I will I will apologize and give the warning also that these words are ones that we're talking about because, first of all, they're so prevalent. They're prevalent in movies, on social media, in everyday spaces like markets and malls and spaces in schools, right? And I'm hoping that it's being curbed, but also you talk about OCD, we hear it in terms of, oh, it's my ADD, and or oh, you're so dyslexic, or if you did, if only you knew, of course the R word, and something that they're hard things to say when you are a part of this community, whether it's from industry experience or diagnosis of your own, right? It's like, but having to have these hard conversations and making people uncomfortable. I think there's a part of this woke culture pushback that is really also intersecting here, right? Where why can't people just go ahead and keep saying what they're saying, right? Like, why can't they just can't? Why do we have to say that? Why can't we say this? And I feel like we're experiencing just a very, to me, very odd reluctance to look at words and vocabulary. And I think we said this in, when we had originally met, and in a couple of other podcasts, we've talked about the idea of we're not talking to each other about what we're going to do in a fortnight. We're not expressing time in those words anymore. And so the idea that language is part of this new weird woke culture that has some kind of agenda around it. For me, there's the need to say, the agenda here is kindness, compassion, growth, and really this is language. Like, and we're not even talking about the people who are being described this way. When we're talking about kindness and compassion, we are actually talking about language itself, that it is a living, breathing organism. It's going to change. What are your thoughts on that? What are your thoughts on really the overall, it feels like a collision of DEAIB, and if I got those letters in the wrong order, I apologize. But we're looking at diversity, inclusion, equity, and then there's inclusion, and then there's woke culture, and how these things kind of are butting up against each other. And they have a lot of the same energy. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think, well, people are creatures of habit. And so we have to acknowledge that it's not always easy to change. And it's not always pleasant to change. But I love that you give the example of the fortnight, because most of the younger people now probably have no clue what that even means. And they'll go look it up and think that makes no sense. That's ridiculous. Why did they even say that? Right. But I think people do not want to focus. They want to focus on intent. Well, I didn't mean anything when I said, let me give a really good example. You guys. I'm originally from Michigan. I grew up saying you guys, like that's all I said. I've been in the South since like early 90s or so. I've never said y'all. Never, until this, like the past year. And then I started saying it because I'm saying you guys so much. And although I don't intend to hurt anyone, and although I'm queer, like I don't mean anything by it, you can still harm someone with those words, right? So I think when people claim that they don't have an intent to hurt someone, and I hate even say call out, because that's the whole cancel culture and stuff. But when you address someone saying something like that, they take it personally, and they acknowledge the discomfort that they feel, and they react by saying, well, there's nothing wrong with me saying you guys. I know you're a girl, just get over it, right? But that hurt is still there. So I'm happy to see a lot of people are really making an effort to be more inclusive in their language. I would love to give a perfect example. Day before yesterday, I was on a LinkedIn audio event with two superstar advocates that I just absolutely adore. One of them is deaf-blind, and the other one is deaf. And one of them said the term analysis paralysis, referring to when you're just, I think it means like when you overanalyze something and you just get that fear in you. And so paralysis in that sense was meant to mean like fear or inability to do something, inability to act on something. And the person moderating it, after a moment, when it was their turn to speak, they said, I want to go back and address what you said. That is an ableist term. And, we need to find a different way to say that. And so the other person was like, oh my goodness, like I never even thought about that. Never even thought that I'm using paralysis, which is a medical, terminology. And they were just like, oh my goodness. And then everything just moved forward. Like they acknowledged what they did. And, you don't know what you don't know. And I think it takes a lot of, I don't know what the word is, but maybe humility, to be able to accept something like that and just say, oh my gosh, like, I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to do that, but I acknowledge that I've caused harm.
Right. And I do wish that was more of the response that we heard. I think, again, within the industry and community, we see that more. And we also acknowledge the two things that you said, that people are creatures of habit. We all grew up using words that our family used, our community used, and that's how, we learn to communicate with each other. So when there's an interruption of that or a disruption, right, then there's the decision, are you going to take a look at your language and vocabulary, and are you willing to hear that may have hurt someone, or that is not the correct term? We're a group of people, and I mean that by all humans, that being wrong is super uncomfortable, right? It's super uncomfortable, especially when in a professional setting, and we all want to be our subject matter experts. And when we are incorrect, or we're being corrected on something that is so vital to communication, and something about what we're going to talk about next is having a safe space, right? Having it be, whether it's on LinkedIn or in a meeting, on Zoom or on a call, where we want our coworkers and the people that we're interacting with to feel like they're in a safe space, and giving the space to be corrected is something I feel like we're all learning also. And just a quick example on my end, in talking to people who have PhDs and who are they're super experts in their field. And I was having a conversation just last week with someone who said, who's describing someone in a classroom, and they said, well, they're very high functioning. And again, I want to say that I'm saying that in terms of making the example. And I definitely felt intimidated to make the correction to someone whose degree of education has far surpassed mine, with several masters and all these degrees. And I just gently said, I do understand what you're wanting to convey. And I want to let you know, in the field of work that I'm in, and something that is really, it's not an acceptable thing to say. And really, we're talking about a person. And so the opposite of that is what we're also focusing on, right? Someone or something has a high or low attached to it, we're saying good or bad. And so it was received in a diplomatic way, I can say that, right? But there's a lot of energy around having psychologically safe, accessibly safe places. And talk to us about how linguistic ableism can either negatively or positively affect these spaces. And how does that actually translate into how work is being done, right? Because it is going to affect whether it's productivity or idea expansion. Let's talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so it's interesting that you used high functioning, because I actually had that written down as an example. And that's one of the ones that I see all the time. Unfortunately, there's a lot of folks in the autism community that use it still, similarly to using Asperger's. And it can be a tricky situation when trying to address that, when someone is like, no, I like that I have something called Asperger's syndrome. And they hold on to that, but yeah, I think it's interesting that you brought up high functioning, because it's so prevalent. My biggest thing when I was getting involved in accessibility, every article, I'll use quotes here, LinkedIn influencer, that was putting out content was focusing so much on colors and captions. And I'm like, well, that's very important. Obviously, like, I'm colorblind. I would love to be able to, equitably participate in the content that you're putting out. My dad is deaf in one ear, so captions are a big deal. Again, bringing in this lived experience. But I started going into spaces and seeing people using words like deadlines and postmortem. For those that don't know, postmortem means after death, but it's you use it like project management a lot. After you've completed a project, let's have a postmortem. Talking about, let's review what went well, what didn't go well. You have people mentioning things like shoot something down, or we're going to set that ablaze or something. How do you think, if you have terminology like that, and let's say a course, because that's kind of like my world, right? And someone in there lost their dad in a fire. One of my daughter's friends, that did happen. And after that happened, I started like analyzing every time I'd see these terms related to like fire and burning up, and I'm going, I can't even imagine how that would make, someone feel. So I started looking around and just started realizing, like, nobody's really including like psychological accessibility. I don't even know if it's a thing. So I kind of made it my thing, and I called it inclusive accessibility, because people need to be in a space where they're not going to be triggered, that they need to be in a space that is trauma informed. They need to see folks that look like them. That's one of the things that I bring in as well. If we have someone who is, let's say, Korean, and they go into a course and they see only white folks being represented, you don't feel like you're represented at all. You don't feel like you're the audience. You don't feel like you matter. And let's be honest, I mean, most of the stuff out there is straight white folks, is what we have like in our content and in, videos, commercials. Watch commercials, like put that lens on and start watching commercials. You rarely see folks that are fat. You rarely see folks that are disabled. You rarely see older folks. You don't often see like a diverse range of, ethnicities and skin colors. Or if you do have skin colors, none of them are very dark skinned, because we have colorism that comes in, right? And, obviously we can't always know what's going to be a trigger for someone. But by focusing on inclusive language, like, we do our best, right? And if any space has triggering content, you give a warning as you and I have been doing, I'm
Sure.
warning you, I'm going to say something. But these need to apply to other spaces as well, so that people have the option to say, like, you know what, I'm not going to be able to handle that. I'm not in a good place right now. And offer different ways for folks to be able to participate in activities or content.
Well, and so we're talking about how the whether it's safe or unsafe space within our meetings and Zoom calls and telephone calls, how they really will also impact the work, right? And before we talk about that, I want to actually to make a point on some of the things that you have just said. We cannot, there's no way for us to anticipate each and every trigger. And of course, the word trigger is even a trigger when we talk about how we're talking about language, right? Every person has the right to identify however they want, right? So if someone does choose to identify themselves identify themselves with disability first language as opposed to person first language, or chooses to use the words within their diagnosis as they see how it fits on them, right? And it's about asking the question. It's about giving the space to say, how would you like to be identified? And giving the room for that. And I think that also feeds into the other part of the question, which is when we give the opportunity for self-identification, self-empowering identification, and combining that with a space that is going to be safe linguistically, accessibility, then that is going to impact the work in terms of our corporate culture or our industry culture, as well as in schools, right? And so what I really want you to talk about is how there could be a very positive impact if that is all done really well, and there can be a negative impact. So talk a little bit about how that is true.
Yeah, that's interesting. I'll give an example of how, and again, I love giving examples because it's my lived experience. I'm not crafting a story. I'm telling, something that has happened to me. At my last job, we were in a meeting one day and someone said the R word when referring to one of the people on their team. Some folks immediately chuckled. And I don't know if that was a nervous laugh, because sometimes something happens and you don't even know how to respond, right? The manager and the person that was overseeing the meeting just kind of did a face like, oh, you shouldn't have done that, and moved on and didn't say anything. And so I immediately messaged him and was like, that's not acceptable. And he's like, oh yeah, I know, I'll talk to her after this. And I said, well, you missed an extremely important teaching moment, because for you to call that out publicly lets everyone know, this is not acceptable. You didn't have to embarrass her, but just say this is a hurtful term, and it's not acceptable. I kid you not, a couple weeks later, another meeting, she says it again. And then she goes, oops, I forgot, I can't say that word. This is a grown woman, in her 40s and 50s. And it just, not that makes it any different, but, my immediate thought is better. You have to know better that this is not acceptable, but you don't know what you don't know. In her case, she knew. And I think it was as a joke to her, because she was laughing as she said, oops, I forgot that I can't say that anymore. Piggybacking off what you said earlier, one of the things that I teach folks in trainings and the course that I teach is don't ever assume. I call myself queer because that's the term that I love to use. But queer started out as a slur. And there's a lot of people that still carry a lot of trauma and pain with that word. And the same for, person first and identity first language. And, I tell them, I say, either ask them how they prefer to be, identified, or, gather it from your previous interactions with them. So if you're on LinkedIn, go see, like, how do they refer to themselves? I think it's just all about respect, though. Like, have respect for others as a human. Be nice. Don't make assumptions. And just, I think the biggest thing is that the disabled folks don't have any obligation to teach non-disabled folks about inclusive language and ableist language. The onus is on others to go learn. And part of that should be learning from, disabled people.
Well, sure. And there is that part of it too, right? Where as we are growing and grown adults, and as we know how to research for anything else, right? You're not going into a job interview without checking out the organization, finding out their website, seeing what they do. And it's the same as when you're meeting someone or you're going to be talking to someone, especially professionally, to find out a little bit about them. We have so many areas that we can get this information now, right? It's we have access to more information now than ever. And so we have the ability to really learn on our own, because there is a part of it where we're kind of putting the onus on the community that needs to have education about it, right? Where we continuing to go back to that community, to go back to a community that whether has been underserved, marginalized, and even as I say those two words, right? Those two words have a lot of energy around them as well. And having the onus or putting the onus on that community to then teach the community that is outside of them about their identity, about how to be inclusive, to be kind, right? Because we know that there are people who think they're being kind, and then they do maybe say something, they make a misstep, which is always, the good intention and not having enough information. So the gap between intention and information can get very wide. And when we talk about education and how the public can learn, especially when we're talking about identifying non-inclusive terms, right? And about what inclusive language is, what can we say to the audience today? We hope that our podcasts are ones that are reaching beyond just the industry or the community that we're in, because there is the whole, like, we're kind of preaching to the choir on a lot of things, right? And really, we need so much of this information to get to the general population. Talk to us about what can the public do to identify and talk about things like, Chat GPT and AI. Let's talk about all those things.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, again, the biggest thing that I would want to see people do is just to be open to feedback. That is a huge problem that I'm seeing, not just with, saying something that may be ableist or racist or something, but even in professional environments, as people are not taught how to receive feedback, and they automatically go into defense mode and, take it personally. But beyond that, again, I say, in order to learn, like, surround yourself by disabled people. And again, don't ask them to educate you. You wouldn't contact an accountant and say, hey, can you show me how to balance my books, and not expect to pay them. Yeah. And not expect to pay them. So
That's
don't
right.
do that to, like, disabled or marginalized folks, but surround yourself with disabled folks. Listen to what they say, listen to the problems that they experience, listen to their voices, even if it makes you uncomfortable, and learn from that, because lived experience, it's such a powerful, like, transformational tool to use, not only for, folks that are advocating, but people that are getting that message, right? In terms of, like, Chat GPT and AI, they can be helpful if let's say you write an article and you're like, hey, I want to make sure my language is inclusive here. I'm going to drop this into ChatGPT. That could probably help, but we do have to acknowledge the bias that is present in things like ChatGPT and other AI platforms, because they are now learning from us. And there's been a lot of different videos and such that have been put out showing, like, one example, and I can't remember where it was, someone was asking, like, what is autism? It was feeding out things like, I don't know if it's called conversion therapy, but they were talking about cures. It was mentioning high functioning, low functioning. It mentioned Asperger's, like every single thing that is harmful that you hear about autism, ChatGPT just spit it out there. And there's been other cases where folks have gone in and said, like, I want to get rid of people that shouldn't belong here in this country, just to see what ChatGPT would say. And it came back with 100% like Middle Eastern countries that you should target. And that's not random. Somehow that has been put in there. So I say I use ChatGPT a lot as someone who's neurodivergent. It helps me, but I say just be careful with it. Actually, I am building an inclusive language glossary on my website. And I hope that can be a source for folks to go to and be able to learn from, but also contribute to, because I'm all about community support, building community, and supporting one another. So I'm actually crowdsourcing it. I've reached out to people, they've given me content that I can put on there with attribution. And it, just like language evolves, that glossary is going to continually evolve. There's other, things out there, just, like we were talking about earlier, Google it instead of asking a disabled person to teach you. But yeah, I think that's what I would recommend folks to do. And just like I said, just have that willingness to learn and be uncomfortable. I'm actually building a podcast called In Discomfort We Grow. And it actually is going to focus on that, like those uncomfortable stories, so that people can kind of learn from it and grow.
I think it's great that a couple of things, like talking about your glossary. I love that it's crowdsourcing. When we think about crowdsourcing, oftentimes we're thinking about dollars, right? And other kinds of ideas. But crowdsourcing, like, this is actually, I think, the best use of crowdsourcing, right? Because you are going to get information from so many different lived experience, and you're going to have a truly organic document, which is fantastic. So I'm so excited to also contribute to that and be able to say, really, on this podcast, and we'll put the information in the notes there, that I really would encourage people to add to it, because this is the grassroots of changing the way that the general population views language and views ableist language and can understand it. So I do appreciate about that whole project, and it's very exciting on so many different levels. And when you said that people take it personally when they're corrected, right? I think there has to be a little bit of whether it's an article or something else about taking things personally. Well, that goes both ways, right? Like, it is very interesting, the feeling of feeling kind of rubbed the wrong way if that you're taking something personally when what you're saying was personally offensive to someone else. So it is very much, it's an interesting term to have something taken personally, right? Because it's generally at the expense of another human.
Yeah, one of the things that I like to tell folks when we're talking about taking things personally or intent, well, I didn't mean to. Well, if you're outside and you're mowing the lawn and you accidentally run over your neighbor's prized tulip, section or something, you didn't mean to, right? But you still did that damage. And you would have no problem saying, like, I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to run over your tulips. How can I help you? Like, can I buy you some more? Can I give you some of my tulips? People wouldn't think twice. Nobody would get offended. But yeah, I love that you said that. People don't stop to think that what you're taking personal is something that hurt the other person, that they took personal. So
Yeah, it's a seesaw.
yeah. Yeah. And I think a lot of that is due to, this is why I'm so big on community, because people are like in silos now. And especially with like virtual and online and people that work from home, or, kids that are growing up like in front of the TV on their games. And I don't see anything wrong with that. I'm a gamer, so I'm not putting that down, but there's not as much of a focus on community as there was years and years and years ago when it was really necessary. Right. And the whole crowdsourcing thing, I do that even when I'm teaching. When I'm teaching a course, I have assignments that I crowdsource where folks go in and put their information in. And it will just, you will be amazed by all the different perspectives that come through. And even me, like I always tell like my students, I'm like, I learned from you. Thank you. Like, thank you so much for teaching me, because I get to hear your voice. I get to hear your lived experiences, because it's different from mine.
That's right. And giving the space and really, again, coming back to the safety and the space of being able to hear new information, to get new information, to be given new information is going to benefit not just the two people in the conversation, not just the one organization that's going to get more information. It will benefit everyone. And again, I do think that we could talk about this subject specifically for hours. And I cannot wait to have you back and talk about the glossary and your website and the blogs that you have already and your own projects around podcasts. And so before we sign off today, and just let our audience know again, we will have all of the notes and all the links in the notes to this podcast. Is there anything else that you want to let us know about before we sign off today?
Honestly, like, let's connect. I know that sounds so corny and everybody's like, click like, subscribe, like, let's connect. I am a people person. I love building community. I love learning from folks, and I love to be able to connect people. I'm a connector, so definitely like connect with me. You can find me on most social media as just at Bela Gaytán, and my website, belagaytan.com.
Great. Well, thank you again so much for your time today, and I cannot wait to talk to you again.
Absolutely. It was my pleasure.
Empire State of Rights has been brought to you by Disability Rights New York, your source for disability rights and advocacy. If you enjoyed our program, make sure to subscribe, like, and share this post. The video for this episode is available on our YouTube channel with closed captioning and ASL interpretation. If there is a subject you would like us to discuss, please email podcast@drny.org or comment below. For more Empire State of Rights, follow us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube.